I stood on the porch of our modest Austin bungalow, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cracked driveway. The air smelled of cedar and exhaust, a faint breeze rustling the live oaks lining our quiet street. My hands gripped the railing, knuckles whitening as I stared at the gleaming black Mercedes-Benz parked, yet again, across my spot. Its waxed hood reflected the fading light like a taunt, a symbol of arrogance I couldn't ignore. This wasn't just a car. It was a declaration of war, and I was tired of losing battles I hadn't signed up for. My name's Laura Hensley, and I've lived in this house for 8 years. Longer if you count the memories that cling to its walls like damp rot. It's just me and Sophie now, my 12-year-old daughter with her father's sharp eyes and a stubborn streak all her own. We've made do since Ethan died, scraping by on my bookkeeping gig and the dwindling savings he left behind. This place isn't much. Peeling paint, a sagging roof, but it's ours. Or it was, until Derek Rollins decided our driveway was his personal parking lot. I glanced back through the screen door. Sophie sat cross-legged on the couch, her nose buried in a book, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. She didn't need to see this, didn't need to feel the frustration clawing at my chest. But it was there, a tight knot of helplessness that had been growing for weeks. Derek's car wasn't just a nuisance. It was a daily reminder that some people could take whatever they wanted, and I couldn't do a damn thing about it. The first time it happened, I'd chalked it up to a mistake. A neighbor's guest, maybe, or someone too lazy to find a spot down the block. I'd left a polite note under the windshield wiper. Asterisk, please don't park here. This is our driveway. Asterisk, the next morning, the car was gone, and I thought that was that. But 2 days later, it was back. Same sleek Mercedes, same smug angle blocking my faded Honda from pulling in after a long shift. No response to the note, no apology. Just the silent arrogance of tinted windows and chrome rims. By the third time, I'd had enough. I marched across the street to the overpriced condo complex where I figured the owner lived. The building loomed like a glass and steel monument to wealth, its manicured courtyard a sharp contrast to our patchy lawn. I buzzed the intercom, my pulse thudding in my ears, and got nothing but static. A woman in yoga pants and a designer tote eyed me as she breezed past, like I was the one out of place. Maybe I was. Mom? Sophie's voice pulled me back to the present. She'd wandered onto the porch, her book dangling from one hand. You okay? You look mad. I forced a smile, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. Just tired, kiddo. Go finish your homework. I'll figure this out. She frowned, unconvinced, but patted back inside. I turned my gaze to the Mercedes again, anger simmering beneath my ribs. This wasn't just about parking anymore, it was about respect, about someone thinking they could walk all over us because we didn't have a fancy car or a fat bank account. I'd spent years swallowing that kind of treatment, but something snapped today. Maybe it was the way the sun glinted off that hood, daring me to do something. Maybe it was the memory of Ethan's voice telling me to stand up for what's ours. I pulled out my phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. My voice shook as I explained, calmly, I thought, how this car kept blocking our driveway, how I couldn't get to work on time, how it wasn't right. The dispatcher's tone was flat, bored even, but she promised to send someone by. I hung up, my stomach twisting with a mix of triumph and dread. What if this backfired? What if Derek, whoever he was, didn't take kindly to being called out? An hour later, a patrol car rolled up, its lights off but still drawing eyes from the neighbors' windows. A stocky officer climbed out, clipboard in hand, and scribbled something as he inspected the Mercedes. I watched from the porch, arms crossed, trying to look like I belonged in this fight. He slapped a ticket under the wiper and drove off without a word to me. For a moment, I felt a flicker of victory, small, fragile, but real. That flicker died when Derek showed up. He stormed across the street just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a tall figure in a tailored blazer and polished loafers. His hair was slicked back, his jaw clenched tight, and his eyes locked on me like I was a bug he'd missed squashing. I stepped off the porch, meeting him halfway, my heart hammering against my ribs. You the one who called the cops? His voice was low, sharp, the kind of tone that expected obedience. Up close, he reeked of cologne and entitlement mid-30s, maybe, with the kind of face that got him whatever he wanted. I hated him already. "It's my driveway," I said, forcing my voice steady. "You've been parking there for weeks. I asked you to stop." He sneered, glancing at the ticket flapping under his wiper. "You think a $50 fine's gonna scare me? This is a neighborhood, lady, not your personal kingdom. It's not about the money." My hands balled into fists at my sides. "It's about you thinking you can do whatever you want." He stepped closer, towering over me, and I caught a flash of something dark in his expression. Anger, yes, but also amusement. Like I was a game he hadn't tired of yet. "Careful what you start, sweetheart. You don't know who you're messing with." I held his gaze, fear coiling in my gut, but I didn't back down. "Not this time." "Neither do you." He laughed, a short, ugly sound, and turned back to his car, yanking the ticket free and crumpling it in his fist. As he peeled out, tires squealing against the asphalt, I stood there, trembling but rooted to the spot. Sophie peeked out the door, her wide eyes meeting mine. "Mom, who is that?" I didn't answer right away. I couldn't, because in that moment, I realized this wasn't over. It was just beginning. The air felt heavier that evening, thick with the promise of rain, and something uglier I couldn't yet name. I stood in the kitchen, rinsing dishes under the flicker of a dying bulb, the clink of porcelain against the sink barely drowning out the echo of Derek's laugh in my head. Sophie was upstairs, her footsteps creaking faintly on the old floorboards as she got ready for bed. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful, not after that confrontation. My hands trembled as I set a plate in the rack, water dripping onto the chipped countertop. I kept replaying his words. Asterisk, careful what you start. Asterisk, a threat wrapped in a smirk, and it gnawed at me. I glanced out the window above the sink, the street lamp casting a sickly yellow glow across our driveway. The Mercedes was gone, but the space it left felt like a bruise, tender, raw, and impossible to ignore. I'd won, hadn't I? The ticket, the police, the small stand I'd made. It should have felt good. But all I could feel was the weight of his shadow lingering, like he'd marked this place as his battlefield now, not mine. The doorbell jolted me upright, a sharp chime that sliced through the stillness. My pulse quickened as I wiped my hands on a dish towel, the damp fabric twisting between my fingers. It was late, too late for neighbors or delivery. I stepped into the living room, the hardwood cool against my bare feet, and peered through the peephole. My stomach dropped. Derek stood there, his blazer swapped for a dark hoodie, hands shoved into his pockets. Behind him, Sophie's silhouette hovered at the top of the stairs, frozen mid-step. "Mom?" Her voice was small, threaded with confusion. "Stay there," I hissed, my eyes locked on the door. I didn't want her down here, didn't want her anywhere near this. I took a breath, steeling myself, and yanked the door open just enough to face him. The night air rushed in, damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of gasoline from the street. "What do you want?" My tone was sharper than I meant it to be, but I didn't care. He didn't belong here, not on my porch, not in my life. Derek's lips curled into a half-smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. They glinted under the porch light, hard and unreadable. "Thought we should finish our little chat," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something jagged. He leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, casual, like he owned the place. "You've got a real knack for stirring things up, Laura." I bristled at my name in his mouth. He hadn't earned it. "I don't know you, and I don't want to. Leave." He ignored me, glancing past my shoulder into the house. "Nice setup you've got. Cozy. Bet it's tough keeping it all together, huh? Single mom, old place like this. Shame about the parking situation." My chest tightened, anger flaring hot and fast. "You don't get to talk about my life. Get off my property." He straightened, his smile fading into something colder. "You think you're clever, calling the cops? That ticket's pocket change to me. But you," he pointed a finger, close enough that I could have swatted it away if I weren't so paralyzed by the audacity of it. "You're starting something you can't finish. I don't like being messed with." And I don't like being bullied. I shot back, my voice rising despite the tremor in it. You've got no right to be here. He stepped closer, the toes of his loafers brushing the threshold, and I caught a whiff of that cologne again. Overpowering, expensive, suffocating. Rights, he said, almost laughing. You're in over your head, sweetheart. You and that kid of yours. That was it, the line he shouldn't have crossed. Mentioning Sophie lit a fuse I didn't know I had. I shoved the door wider, stepping into his space, my fear drowned by a surge of defiance. Don't you dare bring her into this. You want to fight?
Fine.
But you leave her out of it. For a second, he looked surprised, his eyes widened, his jaw twitched. Then the smirk returned, slower this time, like he was savoring the challenge. Feisty. I like that. Makes this more interesting. Mom. Sophie's voice cut through the tension, sharp and scared. I turned my head just enough to see her at the bottom of the stairs, clutching the banister, her face pale. What's going on? Get back upstairs, I snapped, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. She hesitated, eyes darting between me and Derek, then bolted back up, the stairs groaning under her weight. When I faced him again, Derek's gaze had shifted, darker, sharper, like he'd just found a new angle to play. Cute kid, he said, his tone dripping with mock sincerity. Be a shame if she got caught up in your mess. Get out, I said, low and final, my hand tightening on the door.
Now.
He held my stare for a long moment, then stepped back, hands raised in mock surrender. All right, Laura. Have it your way for tonight. He turned, sauntering down the steps with that same infuriating swagger, but he paused at the bottom, glancing back. You'll see me around. Count on it. The door slammed shut before I could respond, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts as I locked it, then double-checked the deadbolt. My legs felt like jelly, but I didn't sit, not yet. I leaned against the wall, listening to the hum of his engine as he peeled out into the night, the sound fading until it was just me and the pounding in my ears. Sophie crept back down, her bare feet silent now, her eyes wide and searching. Who was that? Why was he here? I pulled her close, wrapping my arms around her thin shoulders, feeling her tremble against me. Nobody important, I lied, my voice steadier than I felt. Just some jerk who doesn't know when to quit. But he wasn't just some jerk. He was a spark, and I was dry tinder. Years of frustration, of swallowing slights and setbacks, now crackling to life. I'd wanted to protect what was ours, to draw a line in the sand, but I'd kicked a hornet's nest instead. Derek wasn't done with us, and deep down, I knew I wasn't done with him either. Not after that. Not after he'd stood on my porch and threatened my daughter with that oily grin. I hugged Sophie tighter, my mind racing. This wasn't about parking anymore. It was personal, a power play I hadn't asked for but couldn't walk away from. And as the rain finally started, tapping against the windows like a warning, I felt something shift inside me. Fear, yes, but something else too. Resolve. If Derek wanted a war, I'd give him one. I just didn't know what it'd cost me, or how far I'd have to go to win. The fluorescent lights of Capital Trust Bank buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow across the polished marble floor. I stood in line, my sneakers scuffing faintly against the tiles, Sophie's hand clasped tight in mine. The air smelled of lemon cleaner and stale coffee, a sterile mask over the tension coiling in my gut. Outside, the Austin sky had turned gray, the rain from last night lingering in heavy clouds that pressed against the tall windows. I'd barely slept, Derek's parting words looping through my mind like a broken record. Asterisk, you'll see me around. Count on it. Asterisk now. Standing here, I felt the weight of that promise pressing down, though I couldn't have known how soon it had come true. Sophie shifted beside me, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her brow furrowed as she glanced around the lobby. Why is it taking so long? She muttered, her voice low but laced with the same impatience I felt. We'd come here to sort out a glitch with Ethan's old account, some paperwork the bank had botched years ago that I'd finally gotten around to fixing. It was supposed to be routine, a quick in and out before I dropped her at school. But the lines stretched ahead of us, a sluggish parade of suits and retirees, and every tick of the clock tightened the knot in my chest. I squeezed her hand, forcing a smile. Bureaucracy, kiddo. It's never fast. But my eyes darted to the teller's counter, scanning the faces behind the glass. I didn't know what I was looking for. Some sign of trouble, maybe, or just a distraction from the unease Derek had left behind. The bank felt like a different world from our creaky bungalow, all sharp edges and hushed voices, a place where people like me didn't belong unless we had to. The teller windows gleamed with authority, the employees moving with the practiced efficiency of power I'd never wielded. It made me feel small, exposed, like I was trespassing on someone else's turf. Then I saw him. He was behind the third window, his head bent over a stack of papers, that slicked back hair unmistakable even from across the room. Derek. My breath caught, a jolt of recognition hitting me like a punch. He wore a crisp white shirt and a navy tie, his blazer draped over the chair behind him, but there was no mistaking that jawline, that air of smug control. My grip on Sophie's hand tightened, my pulse kicking up as I stared, willing it to be a trick of the light. But when he lifted his head, his eyes flicked across the lobby and locked on mine, and I knew it wasn't. Mom, Sophie's voice pulled me back, sharp with worry. What's wrong? I tore my gaze away, forcing my face into something neutral. Nothing. I lied, my voice thinner than I wanted. Just thought I saw someone, but my mind was racing, piecing it together. Derek worked here? At Capital Trust? The guy who'd parked his Mercedes across my driveway like a king claiming territory was a bank clerk? It didn't add up, not with his swagger, his threats, the way he'd looked at me last night like I was a problem he'd enjoy solving. The line inched forward, and I fought the urge to bolt. We were next, and every step closer to the counter felt like walking into a trap. I could still feel his stare, a prickling heat on the back of my neck, but I kept my eyes on the floor, on Sophie's scuffed sneakers, anywhere but him. My frustration from the parking mess had hardened overnight into something sharper, anger, maybe, or defiance, but now it tangled with a fresh thread of fear. He wasn't just some neighbor with a big ego. He had a desk here, a nameplate, a foothold in a system that already felt stacked against me. Next, a voice called and my head snapped up. It wasn't Derek. It was the teller beside him, an older woman with a tight bun and a bored expression. Relief flickered through me, but it died fast when I realized Derek was still watching, his lips curving into that same half-smile from the porch. I nudged Sophie forward, my movement stiff, and approached the window. "Hi," I said, sliding the account papers under the glass. "There's an issue with this account. It's been frozen for months, and I need it sorted." The woman, her name tag read Marlene, barely glanced at me, her fingers tapping lazily at her keyboard. "Name? Laura Hensley," I said, my voice steady despite the churn in my stomach. "It's under my late husband's name too, Ethan Hensley." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen, and I risked a glance at Derek. He turned back to his work, but his posture was too casual, too deliberate, like he was listening. My skin crawled. What if he recognized the name? What if he pulled some string I couldn't see and made this harder than it already was? I hated that I was even thinking it, hated that he'd gotten under my skin enough to make me paranoid. "Single mom, huh?" Derek's voice cut through the hum of the lobby, low and edged with mockery. I froze, my head whipping toward him. He hadn't moved, hadn't looked up, but his words were aimed straight at me, a dagger tossed with precision. Marlene paused, her fingers hovering over the keys, and a few heads in line turned our way. "Excuse me?" I said, my tone sharp enough to slice through the tension. Sophie stiffened beside me, her hand tightening in mine. Derek finally lifted his eyes, that smirk blooming full now. "Just saying. Must be tough, handling all this alone." He gestured vaguely at the papers, but his meaning was clear, condescending, probing, like he was testing how far he could push before I snapped. Anger flared hot in my chest, drowning the fear for a moment. "I don't need your commentary," I shot back. Do your job and stay out of mine." Marlene cleared her throat, her gaze flicking between us, but Derek chuckled, a low, grating sound that made my fists clench. "Touchy," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Guess that's what happens when you're used to fighting losing battles." Enough. My voice was louder than I meant, echoing off the marble, and Sophie tugged at my sleeve, her eyes wide. I lowered my tone, but the fury stayed. "Fix the account," I told Marlene, shoving the papers closer.
Now.
She hesitated, then resumed typing, her movements quicker now, like she wanted this over as much as I did. Derek watched, his smirk fading into something colder, more calculating. I could feel the power in this room, the quiet authority of the bank, the way it bent to people like him. Not me. I'd come here to solve a problem, but I'd walked into his domain, and he was relishing it. "Looks like there's a hold," Marlene said finally, her voice flat. "Some verification issue. Could take a few days to clear." "A few days?" I repeated, incredulous. "I've been calling about this for weeks." She shrugged, indifferent. "Policy. You'll need to come back." I opened my mouth to argue, but Derek's voice slid in again, smooth as oil. "Patience, Laura. Not everything's an emergency." The way he said my name, slow, deliberate, sent a shiver down my spine. He knew me now, not just as the woman from the driveway, but as someone he could toy with here, where he held the cards. My frustration boiled over. Years of being dismissed and delayed surging up like bile. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but Sophie's small hand in mine anchored me. I couldn't lose it, not here, not in front of her. "Let's go," I muttered, pulling her toward the exit. The lobby felt suffocating now, the weight of Derek's gaze following us like a shadow. As we pushed through the glass doors into the damp air, Sophie glanced back, her voice barely a whisper. "That was him, wasn't it? From last night?" I nodded, my jaw tight.
Yeah.
She didn't say anything else, but her silence was heavy, loaded with questions I didn't have answers for. The rain had started again, a fine mist that clung to my skin as we crossed the parking lot to the Honda. My mind churned, anger at Derek's arrogance, fear of what he might do next, and a gnawing sense of helplessness I couldn't shake. I'd tried to stand up to him last night, and now here he was, mocking me in a place I couldn't fight back. It wasn't just about parking or a bank account anymore. It was a game to him, and I was losing. But as I buckled Sophie into the passenger seat, her worried eyes meeting mine, something hardened inside me. I wasn't helpless, not yet. Derek thought he could push me around because I was alone, because I didn't have his money or his confidence. He was wrong. I'd fought harder battles than this and come out the other side. If he wanted to escalate, I'd find a way to hit back. I just needed a plan and a hell of a lot more than patience. The rain streaked down the windshield of my Honda as I sat there, engine off, the keys dangling uselessly in my hand. Sophie was buckled in beside me, her backpack hugged tight to her chest, her breath fogging the window in short, uneven bursts. The parking lot of Capital Trust Bank stretched out before us, a gray slab of asphalt dotted with puddles that reflected the looming glass facade. Inside that building, Derek had just turned my frustration into something sharper, something that burned behind my eyes and coiled tight in my throat. I'd walked in there to fix a problem, Ethan's account, a loose thread from a life I'd lost, and walked out with a humiliation that felt like a slap. But it wasn't over. Not yet. "Mom," Sophie's voice was small, cutting through the patter of rain on the roof. "Are we going back in?" I turned to her, her wide eyes searching mine, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. The defiance I'd felt in the lobby, standing up to Derek's snide remarks, refusing to let him see me break, had melted into a cold, heavy dread. He worked there. He had power there, even if it was just a clerk's desk and a nameplate. And me? I was just Laura Hensley, single mom with a beat-up car and a bank account I couldn't even access. The unfairness of it clawed at me, but Sophie's question hung between us, demanding an answer. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice rough but firm. "We're going back in." Her brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. but they said it'd take days. I don't care what they said. I unbuckled my seatbelt, the click loud in the cramped space. We're not leaving until this is fixed. He doesn't get to win this one. Sophie didn't argue. She rarely did when my tone turned like that, but I could see the gears turning behind her eyes. She nodded slowly, clutching her backpack tighter, and followed me as I shoved the car door open. The rain hit me like 1,000 tiny needles, soaking my hair and seeping into my jacket as we crossed the lot. My sneakers splashed through puddles, each step fueling the fire that Derek's smirk had lit. He thought he could mock me, delay me, make me feel small in front of my daughter? He didn't know me. Not yet. The bank doors hissed open, and the lobby swallowed us again. Same sterile glow, same hum of authority, but it felt different now.
Charged.
The line had thinned, just a handful of people murmuring near the counter, and I zeroed in on Derek's window. He was still there, leaning back in his chair, chatting with Marlene like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just twisted the knife he'd stuck in me 10 minutes ago. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out the soft jazz piped through the speakers overhead. I marched straight to his station, Sophie's footsteps echoing behind me, and slammed my hands on the counter. The sound cracked through the room, sharp enough to make Marlene flinch and Derek's head snap up. His eyes met mine and that damn smirk flickered. Surprise, then amusement, like I was a dog he'd kicked that dared to bark back. Back so soon, he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. Thought you'd given up. I want the manager, I said, my words clipped and hard.
Now.
He raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly, his tie brushing the desk. Manager's busy. You've got me. What's the problem, Laura? Still mad about a little paperwork. The way he said my name again, like it was his to toy with, sent a fresh wave of heat through me. I leaned in, close enough to see the faint stubble on his jaw, the glint of triumph in his eyes. The problem, I said, low and steady, is you. You're stalling me on purpose, and I'm done playing your game. Get me the goddamn manager. A murmur rippled through the lobby, heads turning, eyes darting. But I didn't care. Derek's smirk faltered, just for a second, and I saw something shift in him. Irritation, maybe, or the first hint of doubt. He opened his mouth to retort, but Sophie stepped up beside me, her small frame rigid with a fury I hadn't seen in her before. You're a jerk, she snapped, her voice trembling but loud, cutting through the tension like a blade. Before I could stop her, she unzipped her backpack and yanked out an old leather passbook, Ethan's passbook, the one I'd kept locked in a drawer for years. She slammed it onto the counter, the thud echoing like a gunshot, and flipped it open to the last page. Fix her account, or explain this to your boss. I froze, my breath catching as I stared at the numbers scrawled in faded ink. $1.2 billion, the balance Ethan had left us, hidden away in a trust I'd never touched, a secret I'd kept even from Sophie until she'd stumbled across it months ago. I'd told her never to speak of it, to pretend it didn't exist, because money like that changed everything, and I wasn't ready for the world to know. But there it was, laid bare on Derek's desk, the black ink glaring up at him like a challenge. Derek's eyes widened, his smirk vanishing as he leaned over the passbook. Marlene craned her neck to see, her bored expression morphing into shock. The lobby went silent, the air thick with disbelief, and I felt a strange mix of terror and triumph surging through me. Sophie's hand found mine, her fingers cold but steady, and I squeezed back, anchoring myself to her. What the hell is this? Derek muttered, his voice stripped of its swagger. He flipped the passbook shut, then open again, like he couldn't trust his eyes. That, I said, my voice rising with a strength I didn't know I had, is why you're going to fix my account.
Today.
Or I'll have your manager, and every lawyer I can hire, crawling all over this place by tomorrow. He stared at me, then at Sophie, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't spit out. The power in the room shifted. I felt it, a tangible thing, slipping from his grasp to mine. For the first time, he looked small, a clerk caught off guard in a game he'd thought he controlled. Marlene muttered something under her breath and scurried off, presumably to fetch the manager, leaving Derek alone under the weight of our stares. "You didn't think I had it in me, did you?" I said, stepping closer, my voice low but laced with venom. "You thought I was just some nobody you could push around. Well, guess what? I'm not helpless. And I'm not afraid of you." His eyes narrowed, a spark of anger flaring back to life, but it was weaker now, cornered. "This doesn't change anything," he said, but his tone betrayed him, shaky, defensive. "You're still." "Still what?" Sophie cut in, her voice fierce. "Better than you?"
Yeah, we are.
I almost laughed, sharp, bitter, victorious, as Derek's face flushed red. The lobby buzzed around us, whispers spreading like wildfire, but all I could see was him, shrinking behind that counter, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of a truth he hadn't seen coming. My humiliation from earlier twisted into something new, defiance, yes, but also a dangerous thrill. I'd wanted to hit back, to make him feel what I'd felt, and now I had. But as the manager's hurried footsteps approached, a man in a gray suit with a pinched face, I felt a tremor of fear beneath the rush. This wasn't just a win. It was a line crossed, a secret exposed, and I didn't know what Derek would do with it. "Mrs. Hensley?" The manager's voice was tight, professional, but his eyes flicked to the passbook with a hunger I recognized. "Let's discuss this in my office." I nodded, pulling Sophie close as we followed him, leaving Derek behind the counter, his fists clenched and his gaze burning into my back. The rain outside pounded harder now, a drum roll to the turning point I'd just stumbled into. I'd wanted justice, a small victory to balance the scales, but this was bigger, messier. My hands shook as we stepped into the manager's office, the door clicking shut behind us, and I realized the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning, and I dragged us both into the deep end. The manager's office smelled of leather and stale ambition, a small, wood-paneled cage tucked behind the bank's gleaming facade. I sat across from him, Mr. Gerald Tate, according to the brass nameplate on his desk, my damp jacket clinging to my shoulders, the chill of the rain still seeping into my bones. Sophie perched on the edge of the chair beside me, her hands folded tight around that leather passbook, her chin lifted in a defiance that mirrored mine but carried her own quiet fire. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, casting shadows across Tate's pinched face as he adjusted his glasses and peered at the documents I'd slid across his desk. Ethan's account papers, the passbook, my driver's license, all laid out like evidence in a trial I hadn't meant to start. "Mrs. Hensley," Tate began, his voice smooth but edged with something I couldn't place, caution, maybe, or greed. "This is unusual. A balance like this, untouched for years, and now a sudden issue with access? I'll need to verify a few things." I nodded, my throat tight, but my eyes didn't leave his. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in with the weight of what had just happened in the lobby. Derek's smirk, Sophie's outburst, the stunned silence that followed. It replayed in my mind like a film reel stuck on loop. I'd wanted to fix a glitch, to stand up to a bully, but I'd cracked open a vault I'd kept sealed since Ethan's death. $1.2 billion. A number so absurd it didn't feel real. Even now, sitting here with my sneakers soaking the carpet and my daughter's small hand brushing mine. "Verify what you need to," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But I want it done today. No more delays." Tate's lips pursed, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before he masked it with a tight smile. "Of course. We'll expedite it. But this," he tapped the passbook with a manicured finger, his eyes glinting behind his glasses. "This is significant. A trust of this size, dormant for so long it raises questions." "Questions?" Sophie cut in, her tone sharp. "Like what?" I shot her a glance, half warning, half pride, but she didn't back down. Tate blinked, clearly amused to a 12-year-old staring him down like she owned the room. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "procedural ones. Ownership, tax implications, the usual. Nothing to worry about, I'm sure." But I was worried. Not about taxes or procedures. about the way his fingers lingered on that passbook, the way his voice dipped when he said significant. This wasn't just a bank to him anymore, it was a gold mine, and I was the key. I shifted in my seat, the leather creaking under me, and tried to read the man across the desk. His gray suit was crisp, his tie knotted just so, but there was a hunger in his posture, a subtle lean forward that set my nerves on edge. I'd seen that look before, in clients who'd lowballed my bookkeeping rates, in landlords who'd hiked the rent because they knew I had no choice. Power recognized power, and I'd just handed him a glimpse of mine. "Let's stick to the account," I said, pulling his focus back. "That's why I'm here. Not for a financial lecture." Tate nodded, but his eyes flicked to the passbook again before he turned to his computer, his fingers tapping rapidly at the keys. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the machine and the muffled rain outside. I glanced at Sophie, her jaw tight, her gaze fixed on Tate like she was daring him to try something. She'd surprised me out there. Hell, she'd stunned me, flashing that passbook like a weapon. I'd kept it hidden for years, locked away with Ethan's memory, because money like that didn't just solve problems, it created them. And now it was out, a secret I couldn't stuff back into the drawer. My thoughts drifted to Derek, still out there behind the counter, his face burned into my mind. That flush of red when Sophie called him out, the way his fists clenched as we walked away, it wasn't just embarrassment. It was rage, cornered and dangerous. He'd mocked me as a single mother, dangled his petty authority like a prize, but now he knew something he shouldn't. I didn't trust him with it. Not for a second. "Mom," Sophie whispered, nudging me with her elbow. "He's taking forever." I squeezed her hand under the desk, a silent "I know." "Mr. Tate," I said louder now. "How long is this going to take?" He didn't look up, his eyes glued to the screen. "Just a moment. There's a flag on the account, some kind of manual override. I'm digging into it." A flag. My stomach twisted, a fresh wave of unease washing over me. What kind of override? Tate hesitated, his fingers pausing mid-keystroke. It stung clear. Could be an error, or he stopped, his gaze darting to the door behind us, then back to the screen. "Let me make a call." Before I could protest, he snatched the phone from its cradle and punched in an extension, his voice dropping to a murmur I couldn't catch. My pulse quickened, the air in the room thickening with a tension I could taste, bitter, metallic, like blood on my tongue. I leaned forward, straining to hear, but Sophie tugged at my sleeve again. "Do you think it's him?" she whispered, her eyes wide. "Derek." I didn't answer, but the thought had already burrowed into me. Derek worked here, close enough to tamper with something, petty enough to try. Had he flagged the account himself, some spiteful jab after last night's confrontation? Or was this bigger, older, tied to Ethan somehow? My mind raced back to the months after his death. The lawyers, the paperwork, the vague assurances that everything was handled. I'd been too grief-stricken to push, too broke to care about a fortune I couldn't touch. Maybe I'd missed something. Tate hung up, his face unreadable as he turned back to us. "Someone's coming down to assist. Shouldn't be long." "Who?" I pressed, my voice sharp. "Assist with what?" He waved a hand, dismissive. "Just protocol. Nothing to alarm you." But I was alarmed. The walls felt closer now, the leather chair sticking to my thighs like a trap. I glanced at the door, half expecting Derek to barge in, his smirk back in place, ready to twist this into another game. My hands clenched in my lap, nails digging into my palms as I fought the urge to bolt, to grab Sophie and run before this spiraled further out of my control. The door clicked open behind us, and I whipped around, my breath catching. It wasn't Derek. A woman stepped in, mid-40s, maybe, with a severe bob and a navy blazer that screamed middle management. Her heels clicked against the hardwood as she crossed to Tate's desk, a tablet cradled in her arm. She didn't smile, didn't introduce herself, just nodded at Tate like I wasn't even there. "Overrides from upstairs," she said, her voice clipped. "Compliance flagged it 3 years ago. No notes on why." 3 years. Ethan had been dead for. I turned that over in my head, the timeline snapping into focus. Compliance? I said, cutting in. What does that mean? The woman finally looked at me, her eyes cool and assessing. It means someone high up locked it down. Could be fraud concerns, could be legal. We'll need to escalate this. Escalate it to who? My voice rose, frustration bleeding through. I've been trying to access this account for months, and now you're telling me it's been locked for years? She didn't flinch, just tapped something on her tablet. To the regional director. He'll need to sign off. And how long will that take? Sophie asked, her tone biting. Because we're not leaving until it's fixed. The woman's eyebrow twitched, but she didn't respond. Tate jumped in, his smile strained. We'll do our best to expedite it, I assure you. But with an account this size. Stop, I snapped, standing now, my chair scraping against the floor. I don't want excuses. I want answers. Why was it flagged? Who did it? And don't tell me protocol. I deserve to know. The room went quiet, the tension snapping taut between us. Tate's smile faltered and the woman, still nameless, exchanged a glance with him that I didn't like. It was too quick, too knowing, like they were playing a script I hadn't been given. My chest heaved, anger and fear tangling into something I couldn't name. This wasn't just about Derek anymore, or a parking spot, or even the bank. It was about Ethan, about whatever he'd left behind that I'd been too broken to face. Mrs. Hensley, Tate said, his voice softening, I understand your frustration. We'll get to the bottom of this. But it's complicated. Complicated how? I pressed, stepping closer to the desk. Sophie stood too, her small frame rigid beside me, and I felt a surge of pride beneath the panic. We were in this together now, whether I'd planned it or not. The woman sighed, setting her tablet down with a faint clack. There's a signature on the override, she said finally, her tone reluctant. Not a name, initials. Yh. Ethan Hensley. My husband. The room tilted, my breath hitching as the implications sank in. Ethan had locked it himself? Before he died?
Why?
My knees buckled, but I caught myself on the edge of the desk, my mind spinning. He'd never told me, never hinted at anything beyond the trust, the house, the life we'd built. Had he known something I didn't? Protected something I couldn't see? What does that mean? Sophie's voice broke through my haze, small but fierce. Why would Dad do that? I don't know, I whispered, more to myself than her. But I looked up at Tate, at the woman, and saw the flicker of unease in their faces. They didn't know either, but they wanted to. And so did I. The door clicked again and my head snapped up. Derek stood there, leaning against a frame, his arms crossed and that smirk back in place. Trouble with the account? He said, his voice dripping with mock concern. Told you, Laura, patience. My blood ran cold, then hot, rage flooding me as I stared him down. He didn't know, not yet, but he'd heard enough to gloat. And in that moment, I understood something new about him. This wasn't just spite. It was hunger, the same hunger I'd seen in Tate's eyes, the same hunger that had locked this account away. Derek wanted power, over me, over this, over whatever he thought he could take. Get out, I said, my voice low and lethal. You don't belong here. He chuckled, but it was weaker now, his eyes darting to Tate, then back to me. See you around, he said and slipped out, the door swinging shut behind him. I turned back to Tate, my hands trembling but my resolve hardening. Fix it, I said. Today. Or I'll find someone who can. Tate nodded, his face pale, and the woman picked up her tablet again, her fingers moving faster now. Sophie squeezed my hand, her eyes locked on mine, and I felt it, the shift inside me. Humiliation had turned to defiance, yes, but now it was something more. Determination. Whatever Ethan had hidden, whatever Derek wanted, I'd uncover it. I'd fight for it. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about us, me and Sophie, and the legacy we'd been left to claim. The blinds in Gerald Tate's office sliced the gray light into thin, jagged strips, casting a cage-like pattern across the hardwood floor. I stood there, my sneakers still damp from the rain, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and unspoken stakes. Sophie's hand trembled in mine, her small fingers clutching tighter as the echoes of Derek's parting words hung between us. See you around. A taunt that lingered like smoke after a fire. My chest felt tight, squeezed by a pressure I couldn't name yet, but I knew it was growing, a storm building behind the calm facade of this room. Tate's fingers hovered over his keyboard. The woman with the tablet, still nameless, tapped away in silence, and the weight of Ethan's initials on that override pressed down on me like a stone slab. I didn't sit back down. Couldn't. My legs locked beneath me, every muscle coiled as I stared at Tate's pale face, his eyes darting between his screen and the passbook Sophie had slammed onto his desk. That $1.2 billion fortune, a secret I'd buried under years of grief and survival, was out now, a live wire sparking in the open. I'd wanted to fix a glitch, to shove Derek's smugness back in his face. But this was a beast I hadn't tamed, and it was roaring louder with every second that ticked by. Mrs. Hensley, Tate said, his voice cautious, like he was stepping around broken glass, we're pulling the records now. But I need you to understand, this override with your husband's initials, it's not standard. It's complicated. I cut in, my tone sharp enough to make him flinch. You've said that already.
What I want is why.
Why did Ethan lock it? What was he hiding? Tate's mouth opened, then shut, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed whatever excuse he'd been about to spit out. The woman beside him didn't look up, but her fingers paused, a flicker of tension in her shoulders. The room felt smaller now, the walls leaning in, the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing like a swarm of wasps in my skull. I could feel Sophie's eyes on me, her breath shallow, waiting for me to make sense of this chaos I'd dragged us into. I don't know, Tate admitted finally, his hands spreading on the desk like a surrender. The system only shows the override was placed 4 years ago, right before he trailed off, glancing at Sophie, then back at me. Before his passing. For years. Ethan's death hit me again, a dull ache that never really left, now sharpened by this new mystery. I'd been drowning in hospital bills and funeral costs back then, too shattered to question the lawyers who'd shuffled papers in front of me, promising the trust was secure. Had he known something was coming? A threat? A debt? My mind raced, clawing at memories I'd locked away. The late nights he'd spent on the phone, the tension in his jaw when he'd brushed off my questions. I'd thought it was work stress, the grind of his consulting gig. Now, standing here, I wasn't sure of anything. Mom, Sophie's voice broke through, small but steady, pulling me back. She'd stepped closer to the desk, her dark hair damp against her forehead, her eyes locked on Tate. If Dad did it, doesn't that mean it's ours? They can't keep it from us, right? Tate hesitated, his gaze flicking to the woman, who finally spoke, her voice flat and clipped. Legally, yes, if the documentation holds. But overrides like this usually mean restrictions. Could be a lien, a freeze, even a pending investigation. We need the regional director's approval to unlock it. An investigation? I snapped, my voice rising despite my effort to keep it level. Into what? Ethan's been dead for years. He's not hiding anything anymore. The woman's eyes met mine, cool and unyielding. Not him. The funds. That kind of money doesn't sit dormant without questions. Questions. The word landed like a punch, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. My defiance from the lobby, the rush of humiliating Derek, the thrill of flipping the script, crumbled under a wave of dread. What had Ethan been tangled in? And why hadn't he told me? My hands clenched at my sides, nails biting into my palms as I fought to keep my face steady. Sophie didn't need to see me crack. Not now, not when we were neck-deep in this mess. The door swung open again, and my heart lurched. Derek stepped back in, his blazer back on, his posture too casual for the storm brewing in this room. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, that smirk playing on his lips like he'd never left. Regional director's tied up, he said, his voice smooth and barbed. Looks like you're stuck with us for now, Laura. My blood surged, hot and furious, drowning the fear for a moment. I told you to get out, I said, stepping toward him, my voice low and lethal. You've got no business here. Oh, I think I do. He straightened, his eyes glinting with something darker. Hunger, malice, maybe both. A billion bucks on the table? That's everybody's business. Especially when it's tied to a nobody like you. Watch it, Sophie hissed, her small frame bristling beside me. She took a step forward, but I grabbed her arm, pulling her back. Not because I didn't want her to fight. God, I loved her fire. But because Derek's words were a blade, and I needed to be the one to wield it back. You don't know me, I said, closing the distance between us until I could smell that damn cologne again, sharp and suffocating. You think you've got me figured out, single mom, old house, easy target. You're wrong. And you're about to find out how much. His smirk twitched, but he didn't back down, his gaze raking over me like he was sizing up prey. Big talk, he said, his voice dropping. But money doesn't make you smart, Laura. Or safe.
Safe.
The word hung there, a threat wrapped in silk, and my stomach twisted. He knew now about the fortune, about the power it carried, and it wasn't just a game to him anymore. It was a prize, one he'd claw for if he could. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers flexed at his sides. He wasn't just a clerk with a chip on his shoulder. He was a predator, and I just waved a stake in his face. Enough. Tate's voice cut through, sharp and strained, as he stood behind his desk. Derek, out. This is above your level. Derek's eyes flicked to Tate, a flash of irritation crossing his face, but he didn't argue. He gave me one last look, long, cold, promising, then slipped out, the door clicking shut with a finality that didn't feel final at all. My breath came shallow, my pulse hammering in my throat as I turned back to Tate. Above his level? I said, my voice trembling with fury. He's been screwing with me since I walked in here, delaying my account, mocking me in front of my kid. And you let him? Tate's face flushed, his hands rising in a placating gesture. I'll handle him, Mrs. Hensley. I promise. Let's focus on the account. No, I snapped, slamming my hand on the desk, the passbook jolting under my palm. You don't get it. This isn't just about the account anymore. It's about him, about whatever he's planning next. You think he's going to let this go? $1 billion he can't touch? The woman with the tablet shifted, her cool facade cracking for the first time. He's a clerk, she said, her tone dismissive. He doesn't have access to. He doesn't need access. I cut in, my voice rising. He's got spite. And I've seen what he's like when he's pissed. He showed up at my house last night, threatened me, scare my daughter over a parking ticket. What do you think he'll do with this? The room went still, the air heavy with the weight of my words. Tate's mouth tightened, and the woman's eyes narrowed, but neither of them spoke. Sophie pressed closer to me, her shoulder brushing mine, and I felt her trembling. Or maybe it was me. The pressure was crushing now, a vice around my chest, squeezing out the triumph I'd felt earlier, and leaving only raw, jagged fear. I want security, I said, turning to Tate, my voice hard despite the shake in it. I want him kept away from us. And I want this fixed, today, or I'm walking out of here with every lawyer I can find and tearing this place apart. Tate nodded, quick and jerky, like he'd finally felt the heat of the fire I'd lit. I'll call security now. And I'll push the director myself. We'll get it sorted. The woman tapped her tablet again, her movements brisk, but I barely noticed. My eyes were on the door, on the shadow of Derek I could still feel lurking out there. He wasn't done, I knew it in my bones. That smirk, that glint in his eye, it wasn't surrender. It was a promise of retaliation, and I'd just given him a target bigger than a driveway. Mom, Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible over the buzz in my head. Are we okay? I looked down at her, her wide eyes searching mine, and forced a nod. Yeah, kiddo. We're okay. But the lie tasted bitter on my tongue. We weren't okay, not yet. The crisis wasn't just Derek or the bank or even Ethan's secrets. It was me, teetering on the edge of a cliff I hadn't seen coming, my anger and resolve warring with a despair that threatened to swallow me whole. The phone on Tate's desk rang, a shrill sound that jolted us all. He snatched it up, his voice low and urgent as he spoke, and I braced myself for whatever came next. The rain outside pounded harder, a relentless drumbeat against the windows, mirroring the storm inside me. I'd humiliated Derek, claimed a piece of power I hadn't wanted to wield, but the cost was rising. And as Tate hung up, his face grim, I knew the real fight, the one that would break me or make me, was still ahead. The rain hammered against the windows of Gerald Tate's office, relentless roar that drowned out the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint tapping of the woman's fingers on her tablet. I stood there, my damp sneakers sinking into the carpet, my breath shallow and ragged as the weight of the last hour pressed down on me. Sophie's hand was still in mine, her grip tight, her small frame trembling. Or maybe that was me, shaking from the inside out. Tate hung up the phone with a clatter, his face drawn tight, his eyes avoiding mine as he rubbed a hand across his jaw. The air in the room felt electric, charged with the storm outside, and the one-eyed unleashed within these walls. "He's on his way," Tate said, his voice clipped, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "The regional director. He'll sort this out." "Sort what out?" I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip. "Derek's threats? Ethan's secrets? Or the fact that I've been begging for answers and all I get is excuses?" My hands balled into fists at my sides, nails biting into my palms as I fought to keep the fury from spilling over completely. I'd humiliated Derek out there, flipped the script with that passbook, but it didn't feel like a win. Not yet. It felt like a fuse lit, burning too fast towards something I couldn't control. Tate flinched, his chair creaking as he leaned back, but he didn't answer. The woman with the tablet, her name tag finally visible, Carolyn Sims, glanced up, her cool gray eyes narrowing like she was sizing me up anew. "Mrs. Hensley," she said, her tone measured, "we're doing everything we can. But you need to. Don't." I cut her off, stepping closer to the desk, my shadow falling across the passbook still lying there, its faded leather a silent accusation. "Don't tell me to calm down or wait or trust your process." That man, I jabbed a finger toward the door where Derek had slunk out, showed up at my house last night. He scared my daughter, mocked me here, and now he knows about this. I slapped the passbook, the sound sharp in the stifling room. "You think he's just going to walk away?" Sophie shifted beside me, her sneakers scuffing the floor, and I felt her eyes on me, wide, searching, waiting for me to make this right. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But the walls of this office felt like they were closing in, the polished wood and brass fixtures mocking me with their quiet power. This wasn't my world. It was theirs, Tate's, Carolyn's, Derek's, a place where money and titles trumped everything, where a single mom from a creaky bungalow didn't stand a chance unless she clawed her way up. And I was clawing now, harder than I ever had. The door burst open, and my heart lurched into my throat. Derek stormed in, his blazer wrinkled, his tie loosened like he'd been pacing the halls, waiting for his moment. His eyes locked on mine, dark and blazing, that smirk gone, replaced by something raw, anger, yes, but something deeper, hungrier. He didn't lean against the wall this time, didn't play it cool. He strode straight to the desk, slamming his hands down so hard the passbook jumped, his breath coming fast. "You think you're untouchable now," he hissed, his voice low and venomous, aimed straight at me. $1 billion doesn't make you better than me, Laura. It just makes you a bigger target." "Get him out of here," I shouted, spinning toward Tate, my voice echoing off the walls. But Tate just sat there, frozen, his hands hovering over the desk like he didn't know where to put them. Carolyn stood, her tablet clutched to her chest, but she didn't move either, just watched, her lips a thin line. Derek ignored them, leaning closer, his face inches from mine, the heat of his breath brushing my skin. "You're a fraud," he said, each word a dagger. "Hiding behind your dead husband's money, like it's yours to flaunt. Ethan's gone, sweetheart. He can't save you from this." The mention of Ethan hit me like a fist to the gut, grief and rage exploding in my chest. I shoved him back, my hands slamming into his chest, hard enough to make him stumble. "Don't you dare say his name," I snarled, my voice breaking but fierce. You don't know him. You don't know us. He caught himself against the desk, his eyes widening for a split second before narrowing again, that hunger flaring back to life. Oh, I know enough, he shot back, straightening. Poor little widow, scraping by, crying about a parking spot, then bam, $1 billion. What did he do to get it, huh? Steal it? Cheat someone? Or was it you, playing the grieving wife while you sat on a fortune? Shut up. Sophie's voice cut through, shrill and trembling, and I turned to see her standing there, tears streaking her face, her fists clenched at her sides. You don't get to talk about my dad like that. You're nothing. Just a bully who thinks he's somebody. Derek's gaze flicked to her, and for a moment, I saw it, a crack in his armor, a flash of something like shame. But it vanished fast, swallowed by that cold, predatory glint. Cute kid, he said, turning back to me, his tone dripping with scorn. Too bad she's stuck with you. That was it, the breaking point. My vision tunneled, the room shrinking to just him, his sneering face, his smug certainty that he could tear us down. I lunged forward, not thinking, just feeling. The years of loss, the nights I'd cried myself dry, the way I'd fought to keep Sophie safe, all of it surging up in a wave I couldn't hold back. My fist swung, aiming for that smirk, but he caught my wrist midair, his grip iron tight, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Bad move, he whispered, so close I could smell the coffee on his breath. Let her go. Sophie screamed, rushing at him, her small hands pounding his arm. He flinched, loosening his hold just enough for me to wrench free, my wrist throbbing as I staggered back. Tate finally moved, lurching from his chair, his voice shrill as he yelled, "Security."
Now.
The door flew open again, two guards in black uniforms bursting in, their radios crackling. They grabbed Derek, one on each arm, pulling him back as he struggled, his face red, his eyes locked on mine. This isn't over, he spat, his voice hoarse but dripping with promise. You'll pay for this, both of you. Get him out, I said, my voice low and lethal, my chest heaving as I stepped between him and Sophie. The guards dragged him toward the door, his loafers scuffing the hardwood, his curses echoing until the door slammed shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rain's relentless drumming and Sophie's soft, choked sobs. I dropped to my knees, pulling her into my arms, her tears soaking my jacket as I held her tight. It's okay, I whispered, my voice shaking, my own eyes burning.
He's gone.
We're okay. But the words felt hollow, a lie I wanted to believe. My hands trembled as I stroked her hair, Ethan's memory crashing over me like a tide, his laugh, his quiet strength, the way he'd promised me forever before it all fell apart. Derek's words clawed at me. What did he do to get it? I didn't know, didn't want to know. But they burrowed deep, poisoning the grief I'd carried so long. Mrs. Hensley, Tate said, his voice tentative, like he was afraid I'd snap again. I looked up, still holding Sophie, and saw him standing there, pale and sweating, Carolyn beside him with her tablet clutched like a shield. I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened. Security's taking him to the back. He won't come near you again. He'd better not, I said, my tone cold, final. I stood, pulling Sophie up with me, her small hand clutching mine like a lifeline. But that's not enough. I want him fired.
Today.
And I want this account unlocked. Now. Or I'm calling every lawyer in Austin and burning this place to the ground. Tate nodded, quick and jerky, his hands fumbling for the phone. I'll make it happen. The director's almost here. He'll sign off. I swear. Carolyn stepped forward, her cool facade back in place, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. We'll process Derek's termination immediately. And the account. I've got the override codes pulled. It's just a matter of approval. I stared at her, then at Tate, the power in this room shifting beneath my feet. I'd walked in, here a nobody, Laura Hensley, single mom, easy prey, and now they were scrambling, bending to a strength I hadn't known I had. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a hollowed-out shell, cracked open by Derek's venom and Ethan's secrets, leaving me raw and exposed. The door clicked open again, softer this time, and a man stepped in mid-50s, silver hair, a charcoal suit that screamed authority. The regional director, I assumed, his face stern but composed as he nodded at Tate. "Gerald," he said, his voice deep, steady. "What's the situation?" Tate stammered, gesturing at me, at the passbook, at the chaos Derek had left behind. I didn't wait for him to finish. I stepped forward, Sophie at my side, and met the director's gaze head-on. "My name's Laura Hensley," I said, my voice steady now, though my heart pounded against my ribs. "My husband locked this account 4 years ago, and I want it opened.
Today.
Your clerk, Derek Rollins, just attacked me and my daughter over it. I want him gone, and I want answers about why Ethan did this. No more delays." The director's eyes flicked to Sophie, then back to me, a flicker of something, respect, maybe, crossing his face. "I see," he said, his tone even. "Let's get this resolved." He moved to the desk, Tate and Carolyn stepping aside like scolded kids, and I stood there, my breath catching as the weight of the moment sank in. This was it, the peak, the breaking point. Derek's rage, Ethan's shadow, the money I'd never wanted. It all collided here, in this suffocating office with its leather chairs and rain-streaked windows. My anger had carried me this far, my love for Sophie fueling every step, but now I felt it shifting, grief revisited. Yes, but resilience too, a bond with my daughter forged in this fire. Sophie squeezed my hand, her tear-streaked face lifting to mine, and I saw Ethan in her, his quiet courage, his fierce heart. "We did it, Mom," she whispered, her voice small but sure. "He can't hurt us anymore." I nodded, pulling her close, my throat tight with unshed tears. "Yeah," I said, my voice cracking. "We did." But as the director murmured into the phone, as Tate shuffled papers and Carolyn typed furiously, I felt the storm still raging inside me. Derek was down, but not out, not yet. And Ethan's initials on that override loomed like a ghost, whispering questions I couldn't ignore. The rain pounded on, a relentless rhythm, and I braced myself for what came next. This wasn't the end, just the crest of a wave about to crash. And I'd be ready. The air in our new living room smelled of fresh paint and possibility, a sharp contrast to the musty weight of the old bungalow we'd left behind. Boxes towered around us, their edges still taped shut, casting jagged shadows across the hardwood floor as the late afternoon sun poured through the bay window. I stood there, arms crossed, my gaze drifting over the empty walls, bare canvases waiting for a life I wasn't sure I knew how to build anymore. Sophie knelt by the coffee table, her small hands tugging at a box labeled photos, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders as she worked. The silence between us wasn't heavy, not like it had been in Tate's office or the days that followed. It was soft, tentative, like the first breath after a long dive. Outside, the Austin skyline shimmered faintly through the glass, a sprawl of steel and light that felt worlds away from the cramped street where Derek's Mercedes had once loomed. We'd moved 3 days ago, 3 days since the regional director's pen had scratched across the final papers, unlocking Ethan's account, severing Derek's last thread to us with a termination notice that still felt too small a punishment. The bank had scrambled, their apologies piling up like loose change, but I'd taken Sophie's hand and walked out, the passbook clutched tight, my chest aching with a victory that didn't taste as sweet as I'd hoped. "Mom, look at this," Sophie called, her voice pulling me back. She held up a framed picture, Ethan and me on our honeymoon, grinning under a Hawaiian sunset, his arms slung around my shoulders. My throat tightened, a familiar pang slicing through me, but it wasn't the raw grief I'd carried for years. It was softer now, dulled by time and the fight we'd just won, yet sharpened by Derek's final blow. I sank onto the couch, the upholstery stiff beneath me, and took the frame from her. Ethan's eyes, Sophie's eyes, stared back, steady and warm, and I traced the glass with my fingertip, remembering the man who'd locked away a fortune I still didn't understand. Derek's voice echoed in my skull, unbidden. Asterisk, what did he do to get it? Steal it? Cheat someone? Asterisk, that last confrontation in Tate's office replayed like a storm I couldn't outrun, his fists slamming the desk, his venom spilling over Ethan's memory, my rage boiling over into a swing I never landed. The guards had dragged him out, but his words had stayed, burrowing deep, taunting me with questions I'd buried under years of mourning. He was a good man, I said, more to myself than Sophie, my voice low, trembling. Whatever he did, it was for us. She scooted closer, her knee brushing mine, and rested her head on my shoulder. I know, she whispered, her breath warm against my arm. He wouldn't have left us if he didn't have to. Her words hit me harder than I expected, a quiet truth that cracked something open inside me. I set the photo down, pulling her into a hug, her small frame folding against mine like a shield against the chaos we'd escaped. The room felt vast around us, its high ceilings and clean lines a stark shift from the bungalow's sagging roof and peeling paint. This place was ours now, bought with a fraction of Ethan's fortune, a fresh start carved from the ashes of a war I hadn't wanted to fight. But as I held her, the scent of her shampoo grounding me, I felt the weight of that war settling into my bones. Derek's final escalation had come fast, a venomous outburst that still burned when I closed my eyes. After the director's arrival, after the guards had hauled him away, he'd waited, lurking in the bank's parking lot like a shadow that wouldn't fade. I'd seen him through the Honda's rain-streaked window, his blazer soaked, his face twisted with a fury that chilled me more than his threats ever had. Sophie had clung to my arm as we'd hurried to the car, his voice cutting through the downpour. Ethan's dead, Laura. You think his money hides what he was? A coward who left you nothing but lies. I'd frozen, my keys slipping in my wet fingers, his words a blade twisting in an old wound. Sophie had yanked the door open, shouting, "You're the coward. Leave us alone." Her voice fierce, breaking, a echo of the defiance she'd shown in the lobby. I'd shoved her inside, slamming the door, and faced him one last time, rain plastering my hair to my face, my heart pounding so hard I thought it'd burst. "You're done," I'd said, my voice steady despite the tremble in my limbs. "You've got nothing left to take. Go crawl back to whatever hole you came from." He'd laughed, a harsh, broken sound, and lunged, his hand grabbing for my arm. But I'd sidestepped, years of instinct kicking in from nights alone after Ethan's death. A security guard had appeared, flashlight glaring, and Derek had backed off, spitting curses as he retreated into the storm. I'd climbed into the car, my hands shaking on the wheel, Sophie's sobs filling the silence as we'd driven away, the bank's glass facade shrinking in the rearview. Now, sitting here, I replayed that moment. Not the fear, but the strength I'd found, the line I'd drawn. Derek was gone, fired, a restraining order pinned to his name like a scarlet letter, but his shadow lingered in the questions he'd planted. What had Ethan done? Why the override? Why the secrecy? I'd spent years grieving a man I thought I'd known, but this money, this power, cast him in a light I couldn't ignore. "Mom?" Sophie's voice broke through again, softer now. She'd pulled another photo from the box, Ethan holding her as a toddler, his grin wide, her tiny hands clutching his shirt. "Do you think he'd be proud of us?" I swallowed hard, the ache in my chest shifting, softening. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick.
He'd be proud.
"We fought for what's ours, didn't we?" She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips, and set the photo beside the first. "We did, and we won." That word, *1*, hung between us, fragile but real. I looked around the room again, at the sunlight spilling across the floor, the boxes waiting to be unpacked, the space we'd claimed. It wasn't just a house, it was a victory, hard-earned and bittersweet. Derek had tried to break us, to wield his petty power like a weapon, but we'd stood taller, me with my fists and fury, Sophie with her fire and that passbook she'd flung like a grenade. Together, we'd turned humiliation into defiance, fear into resolve. But the cost clung to me, a quiet ache beneath the triumph. Ethan's memory wasn't the same anymore, tainted by secrets I might never unravel, yet strengthened by the love I still felt, the love that had carried us here. I stood, crossing to the window, my reflection faint against the glass. The city stretched out below, a hum of life I'd once felt apart from, now mine to face on my terms. Sophie joined me, her shoulder brushing mine, and we stood there, watching the sun dip lower, painting the sky in streaks of gold and pink. "What's next?" she asked, her voice steady, curious. I took a breath, the air cool and clean, and felt the storm inside me settle. Not gone, but quieter, manageable. "We live," I said, turning to her, my hand resting on her head. "We make this ours. And we don't let anyone take it away again." She grinned, a spark of Ethan in her eyes, and nodded. "Deal." The room glowed around us, warm and alive, and I felt it. Release, yes, but something more. Satisfaction, maybe, or the faint stir of expectation for whatever came next. Derek was a ghost now, his threats hollow, his power stripped. The bank was behind us, the money ours to wield or bury as we chose. But Ethan's shadow remained, a question mark I'd face in time, with Sophie at my side. I pulled her close again, her warmth steadying me, and whispered, "We're stronger than they know." It wasn't just a promise to her. It was to me, to Ethan, to the life we'd rebuild from here. The rain had stopped, the world outside still, and as the last light faded, I knew we'd found our footing. Not an end, but a beginning.